There's a graveyard in southern Virginia where the headstones tell lies. One grave in particular, marked with the name Margaret Wycliff, died 1873, holds a woman who was buried 3 times. Not because of error, not because of flood or fire, but because her sons put her there while she was still breathing. And then, years later, one of them came back in the middle of the night and dug her up. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend whispered around campfires. This is documented history that a family tried to erase, a ritual passed down through generations of men who believed their mother's death was their birthright to decide. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from county records, personal letters, and the testimony of one man who broke the silence in 1947, just before he took his own life. His confession didn't make the newspapers. It was buried, just like she was. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Wycliff family didn't start as monsters. They were farmers, landowners, respected members of a small community outside Lynchburg. They attended church every Sunday. They paid their taxes. They smiled at their neighbors. But behind the closed doors of their estate, something ancient and unspoken governed their lives, a tradition so dark that it could only survive in silence. Margaret Wycliff was the matriarch. Born in 1814, she married young, bore 5 sons, and by all accounts, ruled her household with an iron will. She was educated, which was unusual for women of her time in rural Virginia. She read Latin. She kept detailed journals. She managed the family's finances while her husband, Thomas, worked the fields. But Thomas died in 1868. And when he did, something shifted in that house. The sons were grown men. By then the youngest was 22, the oldest 39. They didn't leave. They stayed on the property, working the land, living under their mother's roof. And according to what we know now, they began to plan, not her funeral, her burial, while she was still alive. They called it the laying down, and they believed it was their duty. The first time you hear about something like this, your mind tries to rationalize it. Maybe she was sick. Maybe it was some kind of mercy. Maybe the records are wrong, but the letters don't lie. In 1871, 2 years before Margaret's official death, her eldest son, William, wrote to his brother in Kentucky. The letter survived because it was never sent. It was found in 1892, tucked inside a family Bible, and it describes the tradition in chilling detail. William wrote, "Mother grows difficult. She has lived beyond her season. Father would have expected us to see to it properly, as his father did before him, and as we must teach our sons to do when our time comes. The earth is patient. It will take her when we decide, not when she decides." Read that again. When we decide, not when she decides. This wasn't insanity. This wasn't sudden violence. This was a belief system, a ritual that had been passed down from father to son, whispered in the hours after funerals, taught as a kind of sacred responsibility. The Wycliff men believed that a mother's life belonged to her sons, that once the father was gone, the sons inherited not just property and name, but the authority over life itself. They believed that allowing a mother to die naturally in her bed, in her sleep, on her own terms, was a failure of manhood. The logic, if you can call it that, was rooted in control. In that time, in that place, women held a strange kind of power within the home. They managed, they decided, they influenced. And for men who'd been raised to see themselves as masters of their domain, a mother who outlived her husband represented something unbearable. She was a reminder that they were still, in some ways, boys, still under her authority, still waiting for permission to truly inherit the family. So they took it. They decided when she would stop being a mother and start being a memory. And they did it with ceremony. According to fragments of another letter, found decades later in a trunk sold at auction, the process was deliberate. They would wait until she was weakened by illness, by age, by something they could later call natural. They would gather in the evening, all the sons together. They would carry her, not drag her, to a prepared grave on the family property. They would lay her down gently, as though putting her to bed, and then they would cover her with earth, slowly, speaking prayers, calling it love. Margaret knew. In her own journals, entries from 1870 to 1873 grow increasingly frantic. She writes about her sons watching her, about the way they measure her strength, about finding fresh-turned dirt near the oak tree behind the house. In one entry, dated March of 1872, she writes, "They are waiting for me to weaken. I see it in their eyes at supper. I will not give them the satisfaction. I will not lie down." But she did, because in the end, she had no choice. On the night of November 9th, 1873, Margaret Wycliff was buried alive by her 5 sons. The moon was nearly full. The ground was soft from recent rain. And according to the only account we have, a confession written 74 years later, she was conscious when they carried her out. Her youngest son, Daniel, was the one who eventually broke the silence. In 1947, at the age of 76, dying of cancer in a VA hospital in Richmond, he wrote a letter to a priest. The priest kept it, never showed it to authorities, never made it public. But after the priest died in 1963, his belongings were donated to a historical society, and that's where the letter was found. It sat in a filing cabinet for another 30 years before a researcher noticed it. By then, everyone involved was long dead. Daniel wrote, "She asked us not to. She begged." But William said begging was proof she had lost her dignity, and that made it our duty to restore it. We carried her on a quilt, the one she made when she married our father. She wasn't struggling. I think she knew it would only make it worse. Her eyes were open the whole time. She looked at each of us. I was the last one she looked at. I still see it. They had dug the grave 3 days earlier. 6 feet deep, just like a real grave. They lined the bottom with straw, as though that would make a difference. As though comfort mattered when you're suffocating in dirt. William went first, lowering himself into the grave to arrange her properly. He positioned her hands across her chest. He closed her eyes, even though she opened them again. He whispered something no one else could hear. Then they filled it in, shovel by shovel. According to Daniel, it took nearly an hour. They didn't rush. They took turns. Each son poured dirt until his arms were tired, then passed the shovel to the next. They sang a hymn, "Abide with Me," the same hymn they'd sung at their father's funeral 5 years earlier. Margaret didn't scream. Daniel says she didn't make a sound. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe her lungs were already failing. Maybe she understood that screaming would only prolong it, would only give them more time to second-guess themselves, and she wanted it over. We'll never know. What we do know is that by the time the grave was full, by the time they patted the dirt smooth and planted a wooden cross at the head, she had been underground for over an hour. They went back inside. They washed their hands. They sat down to a cold supper that Margaret had prepared that morning. None of them spoke. William wrote in the family ledger, "Mother passed peacefully in her sleep. November 9th, 1873. She will be remembered with honor." 2 days later, they reported her death to the county clerk. Natural causes. Old age. She was 59. The town came to the funeral. Neighbors brought food. The pastor gave a sermon about a woman's devotion to her family. They lowered an empty coffin into a plot at the town cemetery, the one with the headstone that still stands today, and everyone went home believing Margaret Wycliff had died with dignity, surrounded by her loving sons. But 30 miles away, on the family property, the real grave settled, and beneath 6 feet of Virginia soil, Margaret Wycliff had been dead for 3 days. For 22 years, Margaret stayed in the ground. The farm continued. The sons married, had children of their own, and the house that had once belonged to their mother became theirs in full. They divided the land. They built new fences. They planted crops where she used to walk. Life moved forward the way it does when terrible things get buried under routine. But something was wrong, and everyone in that family could feel it. Daniel's letter describes the years after 1873 as the rotting time. He said the house felt different, colder. He said his brothers stopped speaking to each other unless they had to. Meals were silent. Holidays felt like funerals. William, the eldest, the one who had organized everything, became obsessed with the family ledger. He would sit at the desk for hours, writing and rewriting their mother's death entry, as though the words could be perfected, as though the right phrasing would make it true. Their wives knew something. They had to. Women always know. But they didn't ask questions. In that time, in that world, you didn't question your husband's family. You didn't pry into what happened before you arrived. But Daniel said his wife would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, staring at him, and ask why he looked so afraid. He never told her. None of them did. The children grew up in that house. Margaret's grandchildren. They played in the yard where she was buried, though they didn't know it. The grave had no marker, just a patch of ground beneath an oak tree that the sons avoided. They never worked that part of the land, never planted there, never let the children build forts or dig in the dirt near it. When asked why, they said the soil was bad, cursed, some of them said. And in a way, it was. By 1895, 3 of the brothers were dead, not from old age. William drowned in a river he'd crossed 1,000 times. The second son, Thomas Jr., died in a farming accident that neighbors said didn't make sense. A man with 40 years of experience crushed under a wagon that shouldn't have moved. The third, Robert, simply disappeared. Left one morning to check the fence line and never came back. They found his hat 2 miles away, near a ravine. No body. No explanation. That left Daniel and the middle brother, Edward, and by then the silence between them had turned into something heavier. Guilt has weight. It presses down. It makes men into ghosts long before they die. Edward became a drunk, not the kind who gets loud and violent, the kind who gets quiet and hollow. He would sit on the porch at night with a bottle and stare toward the oak tree. Daniel asked him once what he was looking at. Edward said, "I'm waiting to see if she comes up." She didn't. But in the summer of 1896, something else happened. A drought hit the region, the worst in decades. The crops failed, the well ran dry, and the ground around the oak tree began to crack. Deep fissures opened in the soil, and one of them ran directly over where Margaret had been buried 23 years earlier. Daniel said he noticed it first. A split in the earth, maybe 6 inches wide, running lengthwise over the grave, and from that crack, even in the heat, even with no rain, the ground stayed damp, dark, like something underneath was seeping up. Edward saw it too. He stopped drinking, stopped talking, just stared at that crack for hours. And then one night in August, he walked out to the oak tree with a shovel. Daniel watched from the window. He didn't stop him. He said later he couldn't move, couldn't call out. He just watched as his brother began to dig. Edward dug for 3 hours, alone, in the dark, and when the sun came up, he was gone. The shovel was still there, standing upright in a half-excavated grave, but Edward was never seen again. Daniel was the last one left, the last son, the last man who knew what they had done. And for months after Edward disappeared, he tried to pretend everything was normal. He worked the farm. He ate dinner with his wife and children. He went to church. But every night, he would stand at the window and look at that oak tree, at the half-dug grave his brother had started and never finished, at the shovel still standing in the dirt like a marker. He said in his letter that he began to dream about her. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where she was sitting at the kitchen table, the way she used to, not speaking, not angry, just looking at him, waiting. And every time he woke up, he knew what she was waiting for. On October 3rd, 1896, Daniel Wycliff went out to the oak tree in the middle of the night. He brought a lantern. He brought the shovel his brother had left behind, and he finished what Edward had started. He dug her up. It took him until dawn. The earth was hard in some places, soft in others, and he had to stop several times because his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't grip the shovel, but he kept going. He said he had to. He said it felt like the only true thing he'd done since the night they buried her. When he finally reached her, he didn't know what he expected to find. 23 years is a long time. Bodies decay, bones remain. But what Daniel found wasn't quite either. He wrote, "She was still whole, not the way a body should be, but whole in a way that made me understand we had done something that couldn't be undone by time. Her dress had rotted, but her skin was like leather. Her hair was still braided the way William had arranged it, and her mouth was open, filled with dirt. I think she tried to breathe. I think she tried until the very end." Daniel didn't scream. He didn't run. He sat on the edge of the grave as the sun came up and he wept. Not because he was sorry. He said he was past sorry. He wept because he finally understood what they had done. They hadn't just killed their mother. They had removed her from the world incorrectly. They had buried her like a secret instead of a person, and now she was both. A secret that wouldn't stay buried. A person who wouldn't stay dead. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Daniel didn't rebury her. He carried her out, wrapped her in a tarp he'd brought from the barn, and he took her to the town cemetery, to the plot where the empty coffin had been buried 23 years earlier. He didn't tell anyone. He went at night. He dug up the empty coffin, placed her inside it, and covered it again. He said it took him 4 hours. He said it was the hardest work he'd ever done, and he'd been a farmer his entire life. When he was finished, he went home. He washed. He sat with his wife at breakfast and told her he'd been out checking the fences. She didn't believe him. He could tell, but she didn't ask. And he was grateful for that. For the next 50 years, Daniel Wycliff lived with what he'd done, both the burial and the exhumation. He raised his children. He buried his wife. He grew old. And he never spoke about his mother to anyone. Not until 1947, when the cancer had spread to his bones and the pain made him feel like he was buried alive himself. That's when he wrote the letter. That's when he finally confessed. The priest who received Daniel's confession was named Father Michael Corrigan. He was 61 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and by all accounts, a man who had heard every kind of sin a human being could commit. But when he read Daniel's letter in the hospital room that day in April of 1947, his hands started shaking. He asked Daniel if it was true, if every word of it was real. Daniel looked at him and said, "I wish to God it wasn't." Father Corrigan asked Daniel if he wanted to go to the authorities, if he wanted to make it public, if he wanted, in some way, to give Margaret a voice she never had. Daniel said no. He said his children didn't know. His grandchildren didn't know. He said the truth would destroy them for something they had no part in. He said some secrets are meant to stay buried, even if the people in them shouldn't have been. The priest struggled with that. He kept the letter. He wrote in his own journal about the weight of knowing something the world should know but couldn't bear to hear. He prayed on it. He asked other clergy, hypothetically, what they would do with a confession of a decades-old murder that could never be prosecuted. Most of them said the same thing Daniel had said: let it stay buried. Let the dead rest. Let the living go on living. But Father Corrigan couldn't let it rest. Not completely. In 1952, 5 years after Daniel died, the priest went to the Wycliff property. It had been sold by then. The family was scattered. Daniel's children had moved north to Baltimore and Philadelphia, looking for work in the cities. The farm had been divided and sold to 3 different families. No one who lived there knew what had happened beneath the oak tree. Father Corrigan found the tree. It was still standing. Enormous. Old enough that it had probably been there when Margaret was a girl. He stood there for a long time. He said a prayer, and then he carved something into the bark with a pocket knife. Just 3 letters. M-A-W. Margaret Ann Wycliff. It wasn't a headstone. It wasn't justice. But it was acknowledgement. It was proof that someone, somewhere, remembered her as more than a story. That carving stayed there for decades. Photographs from the 1970s show it, weathered but still visible. But in 1989, the oak tree was struck by lightning during a summer storm. It split down the middle and had to be cut down. The family that owned the land said the tree was rotted from the inside, hollow, like something had been eating away at it for years. When they removed the stump, they found something. Fragments of fabric, pieces of wood that looked like they'd been part of a coffin or a crate, and bones. Small bones. Animal, they thought at first. But when they brought in someone from the county to look, the person said they weren't sure. They could have been human, child-sized. The fragments were sent to a lab, but the results were inconclusive, degraded, too old to identify with the technology available at the time. The family that found them didn't want trouble. They didn't want their property tied to some old mystery, so they had everything reburied. Deeper this time, they poured a concrete slab over the area and built a shed on top of it. And that's where it still is today. A storage shed in rural Virginia, sitting on top of bones that may or may not belong to someone the Wycliff sons wanted erased. Father Corrigan died in 1963. His journals and letters were donated to the diocese, and eventually, some of them made their way to a historical society. But Daniel's confession wasn't discovered until 1993. A researcher studying rural Virginia families in the 19th century found it in a box marked Miscellaneous Correspondence. She read it. She tried to verify it. She found the town records showing Margaret's death in 1873. She found the cemetery plot. She found references to the Wycliff sons in census records and land deeds. But she couldn't find Margaret's real grave, because by then, it was under concrete, and no one was willing to dig it up based on a letter from a dying man written almost 50 years after the fact. So, what are we left with? A letter that might be a confession, or might be the rambling guilt of a dying man. A grave in a town cemetery that may or may not contain the woman whose name is on the stone. A property in southern Virginia where something terrible either happened or was imagined so vividly it became real in the telling. And a family name that still exists, carried by people who have no idea what their ancestors may have done on a November night in 1873. The researcher who found Daniel's letter tried to take it further. She contacted descendants of the Wycliff family. Most of them had never heard the story. A few had heard whispers, rumors that the family had a dark history, that the sons had done something to their mother, but nothing specific, nothing they could point to. One descendant, a woman in her 70s living in North Carolina, said her grandmother used to say, "We don't talk about the oak tree." When pressed, the grandmother would only say, "Some things are meant to stay in the ground." In 1998, a documentary filmmaker tried to get permission to excavate the property where the oak tree had stood. The current owners refused. They said they didn't want their land disturbed. They didn't want news crews and investigators and people digging up the past literally. The county backed them, without hard evidence of a crime, without proof that someone was actually buried there improperly. There was no legal basis to force an excavation. So the concrete stayed, the shed stayed, and whatever is underneath stayed buried. But here's what we do know. Margaret Wycliff was a real person. She was born in 1814. She married Thomas Wycliff in 1833. She had 5 sons. Her husband died in 1868, and in 1873 she was declared dead of natural causes and a funeral was held in her honor. All of that is documented. All of that is real. We also know that Daniel Wycliff wrote a letter in 1947 describing how he and his brothers buried their mother alive. We know that letter exists. We know a priest kept it. We know it was found. And we know that no one has ever been able to prove it was a lie. The truth is probably somewhere in that gap, between what's documented and what's confessed, between what the town recorded and what the family knew. Margaret Wycliff died somehow. Maybe it was natural. Maybe it was the way Daniel described. Maybe it was something in between that none of us can imagine, because we didn't live in that house, in that time, under that weight. But what haunts people about this story isn't whether it happened exactly the way Daniel said. It's that it could have. That in 1873, in rural Virginia, a woman could disappear into her own family and no one would question it. That sons could decide their mother had lived long enough and take matters into their own hands, and the law wouldn't care, the church wouldn't intervene, and the neighbors would bring casseroles to the funeral. It's that we live on top of stories like this. All of us. Every town has a grave that doesn't sit right. Every family has a silence that gets passed down. Every old house has a room no one talks about. And most of the time, we never find out why. We just feel it. That cold spot. That heaviness. That sense that something happened here once, and it's still happening. In the way we avoid certain conversations or the way we bury things we don't want to name. Margaret Wycliff, whoever she really was, whatever really happened to her, is still under there somewhere. Maybe in the town cemetery, maybe under a shed in the Virginia countryside, maybe nowhere, if Daniel made it all up. But the story is here. The letter is real. The fear in it is real. And the fact that no one wanted to dig any deeper tells you everything you need to know about what we're willing to ignore when the truth is too ugly to look at. So the next time you pass a graveyard and see a stone from the 1800s, ask yourself, who decided that person was dead? Who decided it was time? And who stayed quiet about it? Because if this story teaches us anything, it's that the ground keeps secrets better than people ever could. And sometimes, the only difference between a burial and a murder is who's holding the shovel. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell us where you're from. Tell us what you think really happened. And if you know a story like this from your own family, your own town, maybe it's time someone finally told it. Subscribe if you want more hidden history. More stories the past tried to bury, because there are thousands of them, and they're all still down there, waiting.